And then came Afghanistan.
Right. On December 24th, 1979, that's just about a month and a half later, Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan. From Washington's perspective, this marked a stunning departure from the Kremlin's habitual Cold War practice of keeping its combat forces within the territorial confines of the Warsaw Pact. Now, we now know that the Soviet leadership, from its own perspective, was acting defensively. For the Soviets, a stable and friendly Afghanistan represented a vital interest. By 1979, that country verged on chaos, and Soviet leaders feared that disorder in Afghanistan, instigated, they believed, by the United States, Iran, China, and Pakistan, they believed that chaos in Afghanistan could spread to the predominantly Muslim Soviet republics of Central Asia. The Soviet Empire itself would then be at risk. So panicky members of the Soviet Politburo saw no alternative to armed intervention.
What was the view from Washington on all this?
Well, I mean, there a different interpretation took hold. Perceiving the United States to be weak and Iran vulnerable, the Soviets appeared to be on the march. That's the way it looked to people in the nation's capital. The Soviet incursion into Afghanistan, combined with what was ongoing in Iran, confronted the United States with something approaching an existential threat. Here, from his memoirs, is Brzezinski's vividly expressed analysis. First, he wrote, the Iranian disaster had shattered the strategic pivot of a protected tier shielding the crucial oil-rich region of the Persian Gulf from possible Soviet intrusion. Then the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan had the effect of, quote, transforming that neutral buffer into an offensive wedge. Goodbye, protected tier. Hello, offensive wedge. Not good news for the United States. The President himself echoed this analysis. Within weeks of Soviet troops entering Afghanistan, he was telling members of Congress that a Russian victory there would effectively invite the Kremlin, quoting again, to move again and again until they reached warm water ports or until they acquired control over a major portion of the world's oil supplies. Now here's the key point. On the eve of launching its war for the greater Middle East, policymakers in Washington were worried about oil and about the possibility that the Soviets might gain control of the world's oil supplies, thereby winning the Cold War. Please note, Washington wasn't concerned about promoting democracy or protecting human rights. Policymakers were largely oblivious to questions of religion and culture, not to mention the history of the West's involvement in the greater Middle East. Domestic political concerns related to the availability of oil, combined with a questionably relevant Cold War frame of reference, were driving policy.
So how exactly did the Carter administration respond?
Well, inside the Pentagon, a young third-tier official by the name of Paul Wolfowitz, and we'll be hearing more about him, he was already cooking up a response even before the Soviets entered Afghanistan. In Washington, all it takes to gain the reputation for originality is to question some tidbit of the reigning conventional wisdom while leaving all the rest intact. And by this measure, Wolfowitz qualified as an original thinker. At the behest of Defense Secretary Harold Brown, Wolfowitz had spent the first half of 1979 preparing a classified paper that came to be called the Limited Contingency Study. While affirming conventional Cold War perspectives, Wolfowitz argued in this paper that the U.S. needed to widen its strategic focus. Along with worrying about Western Europe and East Asia, Washington needed to worry about its security interests in the Persian Gulf.
What exactly did the Limited Contingency Study say?
Well, Soviet control of the Persian Gulf, Wolfowitz wrote, would, quote, probably destroy NATO and the United States-Japanese alliance without recourse to war. But Wolfowitz spied a second threat to the Gulf, a nearby one, namely Iraq. And here's the way the Limited Contingency Study put it. Iraq, Wolfowitz wrote, has become militarily preeminent in the Persian Gulf. The emerging Iraqi threat has two dimensions. On the one hand, Iraq may in the future use her military forces against such states as Kuwait or Saudi Arabia. On the other hand, the more serious problem may be that Iraq's implicit power will cause currently moderate local powers to accommodate themselves to Iraq. This suggests, with regard to U.S. policy, this suggests that the United States should make manifest our capabilities and commitments to balance Iraq's power, and this may require an increased visibility for U.S. power. In plain English, to prevent the Persian Gulf from falling into the wrong hands, the United States needed to gird itself for the prospect of war, perhaps against the USSR, perhaps against Iraq or some other local power unhappy with the status quo. In equally plain English, this was at least half bullshit.
Please explain.
Well, take a look at this map. The road distance from Herat in western Afghanistan to the Gulf of Hormuz in Iran is approximately 1,400 kilometers. That's roughly the distance from Chicago to Denver, Colorado. One difference, of course, is that Afghanistan and Iran lack transportation infrastructure possessed by the United States. Armies consume fuel, ammunition, food, water, spare parts, and other commodities on a massive scale. Even in the best conditions, getting supplies to the front isn't an easy proposition. A large-scale campaign mounted out of Afghanistan through Iran would pose logistical challenges that would make the Normandy invasion seem like a piece of cake. Without assured air superiority, which the Soviets would be unlikely to enjoy, forces operating across the desert waste of Iran would be vulnerable in the extreme. Furthermore, sustaining such a campaign would oblige Soviet military leaders to draw forces away from Eastern Europe and from the Soviet border with China, both of which would then be at risk. In other words, a Soviet ground offensive to seize control of the Persian Gulf using Afghanistan as a jumping-off point was from the outset implausible. It was never in the cards.
Surely someone in Washington at the time saw this.
Well, some cool-headed observers did understand this. Here, for example, is George Kennan, who all but invented the Cold War back in the 1940s, in an op-ed appearing in the New York Times at this time. Notwithstanding recent developments in Afghanistan, Kennan wrote, "The real threats to our security in that region remain what they have been all along. Our self-created dependence on Arab oil and our involvement in a wholly unstable Israeli-Arab relationship, neither of which is susceptible to correction by purely military means." Kennan continues, "If the Persian Gulf is really vital to our security, it is surely we, by our unrestrained greed for oil, who have made it so." So in effect, George Kennan was echoing the view of Jimmy Carter's crisis of confidence speech. The solution to our problems was here at home. We weren't going to find the solution to those problems by threatening war abroad.
So why the uproar in Washington? Why didn't anyone listen to Kennan?
Well, we need to appreciate that the actual impact of the Soviet entry into Afghanistan was less geopolitical than psychological. Coming on top of the still ongoing hostage crisis, the Soviet action reinforced a sense among Americans that the United States was losing control of events and that Jimmy Carter was either too dim or too weak to turn things around, as Carter himself was the first to appreciate. Within 2 weeks of the hostage crisis beginning, Washington Post staff writer Jim Hoagland wrote that the Tehran mob is challenging the U.S. position in the Third World and, in a sense, America's national spirit. More than a few Americans believed that responding to that challenge meant that Washington needed to get tough. No more shilly-shallying, but as Hoagland presciently observed, quote, belligerent action to restore American prestige would point to quite a different global future than the one Carter seemed to envision back when Carter had been elected. New York Times reporters dispatched to check the country's pulse found responses like this one from a blue-collar worker in Cumberland, Maryland. "It is the last straw," this gentleman said. "It is the last straw in a series of humiliating events starting in Vietnam. But if you're going to keep slipping in the world, how are you going to have a government or anything else? The time has come in situations like this to say, you can go this far and no further, and this is the time." To have even the slightest chance of winning re-election in 1980, Carter needed to rebut the perception that he was simply tolerating insults to American self-esteem while allowing the nation to slip into global standings.